Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this middle game video I'm going to talk about pawn majorities and how to use them to your advantage. The first thing that I would like to highlight is that having a pawn majority is such an important asset in a chess game, and nevertheless most weaker players, including myself, very often overlook that and fail to play around that. And having a pawn majority and planning your middle game accordingly around that pawn majority can be a very powerful weapon which could easily win you a lot of chess games. Now, what is a pawn majority? A pawn majority is when you have more pawns than your opponent on one side of the board. In this case, if you split the board in half, along here between the D and the E file, you can see that white has a pawn majority on the king side and black has a pawn majority on the queen side. And I chose this first example because it's probably the most important pawn majority position in all of chess, and this is the so-called Berlin endgame. We are going to go over that in detail. So having a pawn majority on one side is important because you are in theory able to create a passed pawn. Now, of course, in many positions it's possible for your opponent to stop that, but generally if you have more pawns than your opponent, then the logical conclusion is that you are going to be able to have one extra pawn once in this case 3 pawns are traded off, and you are going to be able to create a passed pawn, which means that you might be able to win the game making a queen, of course. Why I think this is important for middle games is that if you realize that you have a strong pawn majority and you plan out your middle game accordingly, then very often you could achieve great positional advantages because your opponent is going to be aware of your pawn majority as well, and he is going to have to play to stop your pawns advancing. So this could be a very powerful weapon, a very powerful distraction, and basically a game-changing strategic plan which could win you games. In this first example, let's go over the real position first. This is a board I set up with just the pawn structure so that you can see the real game. This is the so-called Berlin endgame. If you don't know the moves, I have made a video on that, so let's go over them briefly. E4, E5, knight f3, knight c6, probably one of the most thematic openings in all of chess. And most people still can't decide whether this is good or bad for white. The majority agrees that the opening is equal, but let's assess what each side has. Now, black has the bishop pair. That's one thing, and black is unable to castle, which is a deficit. White, on the other hand, has castled, has a weak pawn on e5, which is overextended, and has lost the bishop pair. Now, the fact that the black king can't castle is pretty insignificant because there's no way for white to attack it without the queen this early on. The most important thing that white has, which is the reason why white chooses to play this opening, is the fact that he is granted a pawn majority on move 8. And here white has a 4-3 pawn majority, black has a 4-3 pawn majority on the queen side, but the strength of his pawn majority is dampened due to the fact that the c pawns are doubled. Now, the whole theory of the Berlin endgame is based around white trying to push through his pawns when the position is favorable, making a queen and thus winning the game. So the Berlin endgame is a perfect example of a pawn majority which is so theoretical that people have written dozens and hundreds of books on it, and you still can't resolve the opening, and it's been analyzed until move 30 or 40. So what white is doing here, he's basing his play simply around pushing through one of his pawns, creating a queen and winning the game. So this is a perfect example of that. The first tip that I would like to give you is that if you want to have a strategic edge over your opponent in a form of a pawn majority, then it's very important that you know that you can choose an opening which gives you a pawn majority, and the Berlin endgame is a perfect example of that. So if your opponent plays the move e5 and the Berlin defense with knight to f6, then you could easily plan to play a game with a pawn majority right out of the opening, and that's very important to know. The second example, let's just look at this position. I just want to mention one more thing, but I'll come back to that. The second example I wanted to give you is the Tarrasch French, which is another opening which gives you a clear pawn majority. So let's say e4, e6, d4, d5, knight to d2, the Tarrasch French, and very often players with black are going to play c5 here. And the move c5 will result in a pawn majority for white on the queen side very often. In this position, the players got here. And here you can see that white has a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, and black has a 4-3 pawn majority on the king side. Now let's talk about the differences. Queenside pawn majority versus kingside pawn majority. It's very important to know that the queenside pawn majority is much more powerful if the kings are on the king side, due to the fact that the king is unable to come and rescue the position. So if the kings are castled king side, having a pawn majority on the queen side is a significant edge. If you look at this exact position, without any of the pieces on the board, then you can see that white's plan of going forward is fairly simple. He wants to march his king somewhere around here, push his pawns, create a passed pawn and win. On the other hand, it's going to be much harder for black to do the same thing due to the fact that the white king is already defending this side of the board. So if you imagined these 3 pawns being off the board and let's say these 3 pawns being off the board, then this pawn is going to have a much harder time going forward than let's say this pawn, because the black king has to use several moves to guard these squares. So the queenside pawn majority is often considered much more powerful because it's much harder to stop it from advancing with your king. So the Tarrasch French with black playing c5 and the Berlin endgame would be clear examples of how an opening could lead to you having a pawn majority immediately. And I think that most weaker players, myself included, once again, fail to see the importance of that. Now, I have begun training the utilization of pawn majorities a few months ago because I found that this could up my game significantly, because simply because most players don't look at that, and most importantly because, as I said, this could be such a strong weapon that then it often leads your opponent away from any of his own ideas. And having a pawn majority is very strong, and it could the whole game could be based around that pawn majority very easily. Now let's look at some real game examples. As I said, the pawn majorities out of the opening are fairly hard to utilize, of course, especially in the Berlin endgame, which is a great example. But encountering a pawn majority in a real game could actually be utilized easily. This is a setup I made myself, the second example as well. We are going to look at both. I've just put some pieces on the board, and this is a position which could have come up from a real game. Now, if you have this middle game, it's important that you start thinking the right way. Now, there are, of course, numerous plans you could follow during a middle game, but once you have a pawn majority, and believe me, it's going to happen in half of your games, either you or your opponent are going to have a significant pawn majority, then basing your whole middle game strategy around that could be a great piece of advice. And I would advise you to look at your positions at every move and consider whether you can or can't create a pawn majority. And especially in positions when you already have an edge, such as white has here, a clear 2-1 pawn majority on the queen side, you need to play around that. Middle game plans could be based around several things. For example, if this pawn majority was insignificant here, let's say there was another black pawn here, on a6 and there was no pawn majority, then black would have a clear plan of attacking the b4 weakness. Let's say bishop here, and the rook puts pressure on the bishop, and black would have a clear advantage here, putting pressure on the b4 pawn. Now, once that the a6 pawn isn't here, then white's advantage of having a pawn majority is the main strategic theme of the game. Black's pawn majority on the king side, as I said, is much harder to utilize, and even though the material is equal, white has a significant edge because black can almost never hope to create something from this position, to create a passed pawn, and white can play simply by pushing his pawns forward and creating a passed pawn. Let's look at this position without the pieces on the board. And this is another thing I think you should do during a game. Once you see a position in which you have a strategic advantage, it doesn't have to be a pawn majority, it can be anything else. Try to consider the position without the interfering pieces. And in this case, a pawn majority is usually interfered by pieces. And you need to be able to visualize the position without the pieces on the board. Now, if you look at this position, it's very hard to create a passed pawn, of course, and to queen, because black still has a lot of defenders. If you look at this position here, then you can already see that white is completely winning, because black will basically have to march his king around here somewhere to safeguard the pawn from queening, in which time white is going to be able to just eat all of these pawns and win the game. So you need to, even though this isn't reality, this is reality, black still has a lot of pieces on the board, you need to imagine the position being like this without the pieces on the board. Why is that important? If you see this position and you realize that if all of the pieces are traded off, you're going to get this winning position, then your strategy changes. You don't go pushing your pawns and creating a passed pawn here like a lunatic and putting your pawn on a7 and just not winning. Then your strategy becomes, okay, if I trade off the pieces, I'm winning because I have a pawn majority which can easily become a queen. So your strategy is, okay, how do I exchange of the pieces? How do I remove all of these pieces from the board? A good start might be rook takes rook. Okay, let's just play this position out. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight. Now it's already much easier, as you can see. Let's say rook here. Black shouldn't really exchange. If he doesn't exchange this, then he is giving up the file. Let's say the rook moves. Now we can already think about winning some pieces. So in this position it's fairly straightforward, and it's easy for white to do that because I set up the position. It's not from a real game, but very often if you look at your position objectively and assess your strategic weaknesses correctly, then you're going to be able to play your middle game in the correct fashion and playing on your strengths. And in this case, your strength is your pawn majority. You're going to amplify that strength by trading off the pieces. So the main strategy here is to trade off the pieces. Let's look at another example. One more clear case of a pawn majority on the queen side. Once again, what is your strategy? If you look at the position without the pieces on the board, once again, try to imagine that. Boom, you visualized it. This position is winning for white. Black is going to have a rough time marching his king all the way down here to stop the pawns, and white can easily blockade and try to attack the black pawns by coming into d6, e7 and trying to attack these pawns here. So white is basically faster. Now, once again, you have this position. What do? I have a strong pawn majority. I would like to push my pawns, but I can't push my pawns yet because there's no significance in that, because all of the defenders are still on the board. So now you play around that. And your opponent, and this is what I was talking about at start, most weaker players don't think in this manner. Your opponent won't think most often, oh, if I trade off the pieces, I'm going to lose because he has a 3-2 on the queen side. You need to think that way. Whenever you have a strength in the position, you need to amplify that strength. The way to amplify this 3-2 pawn majority is to trade off the pieces. Okay, it might the position might change, and you might be able to create a winning attack, in which case you're going to stop that strategy and change it. But here it's very clear that if white trades off the pieces and gets his king closer to the queen side, he's going to be able to win. So once again, if you would like to play with a pawn majority, I would advise you choose openings such as the Berlin with the Berlin endgame with the white pieces, and the Tarrasch French against the French, for example. There are more openings, you can find them. Just consider your opening repertoire, look at the middle game positions which you get, and try to find games in which you have a pawn majority. I myself play the Caro-Kann, so I don't get positions like this very often. But yeah, try to find positions in the openings which you play where you can have a pawn majority. And the great training method is to take this position, for example. If you play the Tarrasch French, then this is going to happen very often, a position similar to this. Put it on the board without the pieces and try to find a way to queen those pawns. So once you get this position in a real game, then you are going to be much smarter in doing the same thing and trying to queen your pawns. So a pawn majority is a very strong weapon in the middle game, and a strategic advantage which even though you get it for free, basically, white basically got his pawn majority for free here. Even though you get it for free, it could be deadly for your opponent. Now, I'm not saying that once you get this position on move 10 in the Tarrasch French, you are winning. If black has activity, if black can neutralize your pawn majority, if black pushes his pawn to b4, then you have nothing. But I'm saying that it's a very powerful weapon, which, if utilized properly, your opponent is going to have to stop. Your opponent is going to have to stop creating ideas of his own. He's going to have to defend, which is going to cost him time, either time or development or attacking play or whatever else. So once you have this, you need to realize that this is your card up your sleeve and then that you need to play accordingly. Okay, everybody, I hope you like this video on pawn majorities. I didn't want to go into too much detail. I basically wanted to make it a video which is going to give you the idea and to emphasize that you should look at your pawn majority during the game, because the first and most important thing is that you realize that you do have a weapon, and I hope I managed to explain that well. Thanks very much. Please let me know what you think. Let me know which openings you play, which result in a pawn majority on either side of the board. And stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye-bye.